I was cutting into my mom's famous pot roast when my twin brother Jake casually mentioned the family investment that would destroy everything I thought I knew about fairness. $400,000. That's what my parents had given him for his cryptocurrency mining startup, while they denied me even $5,000 for my established marketing consultancy 6 months earlier. The revelation hit me like a freight train as I sat there with my fork suspended midway to my mouth, watching Jake gesture excitedly about his revolutionary business plan. I'd worked 3 jobs to fund my company while the golden child got handed everything on a silver platter. The ultimate betrayal crystallized in that moment as I realized years of inequality had reached its financial breaking point. Growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, the favoritism wasn't subtle. Jake was the star athlete, the charismatic one, the child who could do no wrong in David and Margaret's eyes. I was Rita, the responsible twin, the straight-A student who remained invisible despite every achievement. Now, at 28, I'd built my marketing consultancy from absolutely nothing, working nights at Romano's Italian restaurant while studying, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and endless determination. My business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. I'd helped dozens of small businesses grow their customer base, increase revenue, and build sustainable marketing strategies. Every dollar I earned came from honest work, late nights, and genuine expertise. I'd started with a borrowed laptop and a corner of my studio apartment, gradually building relationships with local business owners who trusted my skills over flashy agencies. When Jake revealed his revolutionary business plan during that dinner, I immediately saw the glaring problems. He wanted to create a cryptocurrency mining farm, targeting green crypto, using solar panels to mine Bitcoin alternatives. The plan was riddled with issues that any basic market research would have revealed. The cryptocurrency mining market was oversaturated, the upfront costs were massive, and the returns were completely unpredictable. The environmental angle sounded impressive, but ignored the reality of energy costs and regulatory challenges. But our parents were absolutely dazzled by Jake's presentation. He'd put together this slick PowerPoint filled with buzzwords like blockchain technology, sustainable energy integration, and projected profit margins that seemed to dance off the screen. David's eyes lit up when Jake mentioned potential annual returns of 200%. Margaret kept nodding enthusiastically, asking questions that showed she didn't understand the technology but loved Jake's confidence. The memory of my own failed request 6 months earlier burned in my chest. I'd approached them with a detailed business plan for expanding my consultancy. I needed $5,000 to hire an assistant, upgrade my software subscriptions, and rent proper office space instead of working from coffee shops and my apartment. My request included financial projections based on actual client contracts, testimonials from satisfied customers, and a clear timeline for repayment. Their response had been devastating. David claimed they couldn't afford to gamble on my business, suggesting I needed to prove myself first. Margaret had used that phrase that still echoed in my nightmares, "Figure it out yourself." They'd said I was smart enough to find another way, that they'd worked their entire lives without family handouts, and that I should follow their example of self-reliance. But Jake's request wasn't called a gamble. It was an investment. His unproven concept with zero track record deserved $400,000 while my established business with actual revenue couldn't justify $5,000. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I spent hours researching Jake's revolutionary idea online, hoping I was wrong about its flaws. What I discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. Jake had essentially copied a failed startup from California called Green Chain Mining that had gone bankrupt the previous year. He'd changed minor details like the specific cryptocurrency targets and the geographic location, but the core business model was identical. Even some of his presentation slides looked suspiciously similar to Green Chain's promotional materials. I found articles about Green Chain's spectacular failure. They'd burned through $800,000 in investor money over 18 months before folding. The company had faced exactly the regulatory hurdles, energy cost overruns, and market volatility issues that any competent analysis would have predicted. The founder had admitted in interviews that they'd been overly optimistic about profit timelines and hadn't adequately researched the technical challenges. The next morning, I called my parents to share my research. I explained the Green Chain precedent, outlined the specific risks Jake's plan hadn't addressed, and offered to help them conduct proper due diligence before investing such a massive amount. David's response was swift and cutting. He accused me of jealousy and sibling rivalry, suggesting that my criticism came from resentment rather than legitimate business concerns. Margaret's words were even more painful. She said I'd always been negative about Jake's dreams and that maybe I should focus on building my own success instead of tearing down my brother's opportunities. They'd made their decision. $400,000 would go to Jake's revolutionary business while I continued to figure it out myself. The sting of my family's rejection fueled something fierce inside me. If they wouldn't support my dreams, I'd prove their judgment wrong through sheer determination. I threw myself into building my business with the intensity of someone who had everything to prove and nothing left to lose. Within 2 months, I'd landed 3 major clients that transformed my revenue stream. The first was Sweetside Bakery, a local chain with 4 locations that needed help competing against the corporate giants moving into our area. I developed a community-focused marketing strategy that emphasized their family recipes and local ingredients, increasing their monthly sales by 35% within 60 days. The second client was Patterson & Associates, a boutique law firm specializing in family law. They'd been struggling to differentiate themselves in Denver's competitive legal market. I created a content marketing approach that positioned them as the compassionate choice for families going through difficult times, combining educational blog posts with client testimonials that highlighted their personal attention. Their new client consultations increased by 50% in the first quarter. My third major client was Mountain View Home Renovations, a mid-sized contractor who'd built their business through word of mouth but needed help scaling up. I designed a comprehensive digital marketing strategy that showcased their craftsmanship through before and after photo galleries, customer video testimonials, and targeted social media advertising. Their project bookings doubled within 3 months. These successes required sacrifice that my family never witnessed. I worked 18-hour days, sacrificing weekends, social connections, and basic health needs. My apartment became a 24/7 office space. I survived on coffee, determination, and the satisfaction of watching my clients succeed. My monthly revenue grew from $2,000 to $8,000 through relentless hustle and genuine expertise. Meanwhile, Jake's venture began with the kind of fanfare I'd never experienced. He rented an expensive warehouse in an industrial district north of Denver, the kind of space that cost $8,000 monthly before any equipment or employees. He purchased top-tier mining equipment, hired a team of 5 full-time employees, and began talking about his business like it was already a guaranteed success. I watched him throw money around with the carelessness of someone who'd never earned it. Expensive team dinners at upscale restaurants became weekly events. He bought premium equipment when budget alternatives would have served the same function. His launch party cost more than my entire annual marketing budget, featuring catered food, open bar, and a live band for an event that attracted mostly family friends and curious neighbors. I calculated his monthly burn rate at approximately $30,000, not including the initial equipment purchases. His expenses seemed designed more for impressing people than building sustainable business operations. Every dollar he spent carelessly represented weeks of my careful budgeting and strategic planning. But the real devastation came during a routine visit to my bank branch where I'd maintained a savings account since turning 16. I'd been slowly building this fund through part-time jobs during high school, summer work during college, birthday gifts from relatives, and every spare dollar I could save. The account held $15,000, representing over a decade of careful saving. I'd always thought of it as my emergency fund, an eventual house down payment. The banker, Mrs. Rodriguez, looked confused when I asked about making a withdrawal. She pulled up my account and explained gently that the funds had been withdrawn 2 months earlier. My parents, as joint account holders from when I'd been a minor, had cleaned out the account completely. The withdrawal slip showed Margaret's signature and a notation about business investment purposes. My hands shook as Mrs. Rodriguez showed me the paperwork. $15,000. Gone. Every birthday dollar from my grandparents, every paycheck from my high school job at the grocery store, every sacrifice I'd made to save instead of spend. All of it transferred to fund Jake's revolutionary business while I scraped together money for basic business expenses. When I confronted my parents that evening, Their response was even more infuriating than the theft itself. David admitted they'd taken my money to provide Jake with additional operational capital because his business needed more resources for success. Margaret actually had the audacity to say that since I was so good at figuring things out myself, they knew I didn't really need the money anyway. They promised to repay me when Jake's business became profitable. The casual certainty in their voices suggested they'd never considered the possibility of failure. In their minds, Jake's success was inevitable, and my $15,000 was simply an advance on future family wealth that would benefit everyone. I realized this wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was financial theft of my own money to fund the golden child's failure. They'd stolen my decade of savings to support their chosen child while telling me to figure out my own success. The betrayal cut deeper than any childhood inequality because it involved my own hard-earned money being used against my interests. Standing in their living room, looking at the people who'd raised me, I understood that family loyalty had become a one-way street. They expected my sacrifice but offered no support. They demanded my understanding while showing no respect for my achievements. They'd chosen their golden child, and I was simply the source of funding for his dreams. 4 months into Jake's revolutionary venture, I began noticing subtle cracks in his confident facade. The enthusiastic social media updates about crushing it and exponential growth started feeling forced, like someone trying too hard to convince themselves as much as their audience. When family conversations turned to business updates, Jake became evasive, changing subjects quickly or deflecting with jokes about being too busy for detailed explanations. My own business continued its steady growth trajectory. I'd reached $12,000 in monthly revenue and finally hired my first employee, Amy Chen, a recent marketing graduate with excellent skills and unlimited enthusiasm. Having help allowed me to focus on strategic planning and client relationships, while Amy handled the operational details that had been consuming my time. For the first time since starting my business, I felt like I was building something sustainable rather than just surviving. The truth about Jake's situation revealed itself accidentally during what should have been a routine visit to his warehouse. Margaret had asked me to drop off lunch for him since I was in that part of town meeting with a potential client. I'd agreed reluctantly, still angry about the stolen savings but trying to maintain some family peace for my parents' sake. The industrial district seemed quieter than I remembered from Jake's launch party months earlier. When I reached his warehouse, the vast space that had once buzzed with activity felt almost empty. Only 2 employees remained, working half-heartedly at a few remaining mining rigs. Most of the expensive equipment Jake had purchased with such fanfare was simply gone, leaving empty tables and disconnected power cables throughout the facility. Jake wasn't there, which surprised me since he'd always claimed to be hands-on with daily operations. One of the remaining employees, Marcus, recognized me from family photos Jake had shown around. His expression was sympathetic as he approached to explain the situation. The employees hadn't been paid in 6 weeks. Most of the mining equipment had been sold to cover debts and operational expenses. The revolutionary green energy component, the solar panel installation that was supposed to differentiate Jake's business from competitors, had never been completed due to permit issues that Jake had never properly researched. The mining operation was running on expensive grid electricity, eliminating any cost advantage and making profitability impossible at current cryptocurrency prices. Marcus seemed genuinely concerned about Jake's welfare. He explained that Jake had been coming in less frequently, often seeming stressed and distracted. The remaining employees were staying only because they hoped Jake would eventually pay their back wages, but Marcus admitted he'd started looking for other work because he couldn't afford to work for free indefinitely. I thanked Marcus for his honesty and left the lunch with him, knowing Jake probably wouldn't show up that day. The drive home gave me time to process what I'd witnessed. $400,000 plus my $15,000 had been burned through in 4 months. The revolutionary business was failing exactly as I'd predicted, but Jake was hiding the truth from our parents. But personal betrayal runs deeper than business failure. As I drove through downtown Denver, I noticed Jake's car parked outside Mercantile, an upscale restaurant I'd never been able to afford. Through the window, I could see him at a corner table with someone familiar. Sarah Mitchell, my former best friend who'd mysteriously cut contact with me 8 months earlier without explanation. They were sitting close, holding hands, sharing the kind of intimate conversation that indicated a serious relationship. Sarah was laughing at something Jake said, her expression showing the comfort of established intimacy. This wasn't a first date or casual encounter. They'd clearly been together for months, which explained Sarah's sudden coldness toward me and her refusal to return calls or meet for our usual coffee dates. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Jake had been using family money to fund not just his failing business, but an expensive lifestyle that included courting my former best friend. The upscale dinners, weekend trips, and lavish gestures that Sarah had probably attributed to his business success were actually financed by my parents' retirement savings and my stolen college fund. I parked across the street and watched them for a few minutes, processing the layers of betrayal. My twin brother had stolen my money, lied to our parents about his business performance, and somehow convinced my best friend to date him without ever mentioning it to me. The isolation I'd felt over the past months suddenly made sense. Sarah hadn't just drifted away from our friendship. She'd been actively avoiding me to hide her relationship with Jake. When I confronted Jake privately the next evening at his apartment, his confident mask finally slipped completely. Faced with evidence of his business failure and secret relationship, he broke down in tears that seemed genuine for the first time in years. He admitted everything. The mining operation was hemorrhaging money, most of the initial investment was already gone, and he'd been fabricating progress reports to keep our parents from panicking. His explanation for the deception was that he was trying to protect the family from stress. He claimed he'd been working frantically to turn things around, selling equipment to buy time while he figured out a new strategy. The relationship with Sarah was real, he insisted, and he'd kept it secret because he knew I'd be upset about him dating my friend during our family conflicts. Jake begged me not to tell our parents about the business failure, promising he could still salvage the situation if I gave him more time. He had plans for pivoting to different cryptocurrency strategies, ideas for cutting costs, and connections with potential new investors. He just needed a few more months to prove that their faith in him wasn't misplaced. Looking at my brother's tears and desperate promises, I realized that his crisis was just beginning. Our parents had no idea they were heading toward financial ruin, and Jake's desperation was making him increasingly reckless. The question wasn't whether his business would fail completely, but how much damage it would cause to everyone around him before the inevitable collapse. For 2 weeks after Jake's confession, I wrestled with an impossible decision. Part of me wanted to protect my parents from the devastating truth about their investment, while another part knew they deserved to understand what was happening to their money before they lost even more. My conscience wouldn't let me stay silent while they remained unaware of the financial disaster unfolding around them. I decided to approach the situation gradually, planning to have a careful conversation with my parents about Jake's business performance and suggest they request detailed financial reports before considering any additional investments. I wanted to give them information that would help them make informed decisions without feeling like I was attacking Jake out of spite. But when I arrived for our usual Sunday family dinner, I discovered my protective warnings were already too late. David was practically glowing with excitement as he announced their latest strategic decision. They'd made another major investment in Jake's business, $200,000 from a mortgage they'd taken against their retirement home in Colorado Springs. The beautiful cabin in the mountains represented 30 years of careful saving and planning. David and Margaret had bought the property 15 years earlier as their dream retirement destination, a place where they could enjoy peaceful mountain views, hiking trails, and distance from city stress. They'd paid off the mortgage 3 years ago and talked constantly about their plans to move there full-time when David retired from his accounting firm. Now they'd leverage that dream to fund Jake's failing business. Margaret showed me photos of the property while explaining how confident they were that this additional capital would push Jake's venture over the profitability threshold. She talked about the cabin as if it was just another investment asset rather than the cornerstone of their retirement security. David explained their reasoning with the kind of financial logic that sounded sophisticated but ignored crucial realities. Jake's business was positioned for exponential growth, he said, but needed sufficient capital to reach critical mass. The mortgage was a strategic use of their equity to maximize family wealth over the long term. They'd calculated that Jake's projected returns would easily cover the mortgage payments while generating substantial additional income. I listened to their excitement with growing horror. knowing they'd just committed themselves to monthly mortgage payments on a property they'd owned free and clear, while their son burned through their money on a business that was already failing. They'd turned their retirement security into another funding source for Jake's lies. That evening, I checked my credit report as part of my usual monthly financial review, a habit I'd developed to monitor my improving business credit score. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Someone had opened a business credit card in my name 2 months earlier with a $25,000 limit that was already nearly maxed out. The billing address was Jake's warehouse. My identity had been stolen by my own brother to fund his failing business. Every late payment, every maxed out balance, every default would appear on my credit report and damage the financial reputation I'd worked so hard to build. Jake had not only stolen my savings but was now actively destroying my financial future to extend his business failure a few more weeks. I confronted Jake again, this time with the credit card statements I'd printed and a clear ultimatum. He had 48 hours to remove my name from all accounts, pay off the balances, and provide written documentation that I had no responsibility for any debts he'd incurred using my identity. If he didn't comply, I would file police reports for identity theft and tell our parents everything about his business failure. Jake's response revealed just how desperate he'd become. Between tears and apologies, he explained that the credit card had been a temporary solution to keep the business operating until the new parental investment came through. He'd been planning to pay off the balance immediately and remove my name before I ever found out about it. He claimed he was desperate to protect the family's reputation and maintain hope for future success. His promises felt empty, but I gave him the 48-hour deadline anyway, hoping family loyalty might motivate him to do the right thing. Meanwhile, my own business reached another milestone, my first $15,000 month. Amy had suggested we needed to expand to a larger office space and hire 2 more employees to handle our growing client load. I realized I'd achieved more genuine business success with no family support than Jake had accomplished with over $600,000 in funding. The 48 hours passed without Jake addressing the credit card situation. Instead, I received a call from my bank's fraud department that made the identity theft even more serious. Additional credit accounts had been opened in my name beyond the single business card I'd discovered. There were signs of systematic identity theft, including utility accounts, equipment financing, and even attempts to open business banking accounts using my personal information. Jake hadn't just stolen my identity once in desperation. He'd been systematically using my information to fund his failing business for months, creating a web of financial obligations that could take years to untangle and might destroy my credit permanently. The brother I'd grown up with, shared a womb with, learned to walk beside, had decided my financial future was acceptable collateral damage for his business fantasies. Standing in my apartment that night, looking at pages of fraudulent accounts opened in my name, I realized the time for family loyalty and protective silence had ended. Jake wasn't just failing in business. He was actively destroying other people's lives to delay acknowledging his failure. My parents weren't just making poor investment decisions. They were being systematically lied to by someone they trusted completely. The truth needed to come out before any more damage was done. Filing police reports for identity theft felt like crossing a line I'd never imagined reaching with family, but Jake's systematic fraud left me no choice. The detective assigned to my case, Detective Barnes, explained that identity theft between family members was more common than people realized and often involved the same patterns I was experiencing. Gradual escalation from small, unauthorized uses to comprehensive financial fraud. As I gathered documentation for the criminal case, I discovered that Jake's betrayal extended even deeper than identity theft. 3 of my major clients had mysteriously canceled their contracts over the past month. Sweetside Bakery, Patterson and Associates, and Mountain View Home Renovations had all cited budget constraints and going with a cheaper competitor as their reasons for ending our successful partnerships. Investigation into these sudden cancellations revealed the devastating truth. Jake had started his own marketing consultancy as a side business, using my client list to target my customers directly. He'd accessed my client information during family gatherings when I'd worked on my laptop in their presence, trusting my family enough to leave my computer unlocked while grabbing coffee or using the bathroom. Jake's marketing approach was simple and destructive. undercut my prices dramatically by offering services at a loss, subsidized by the remaining family money he controlled. He was essentially using our parents' investment to destroy my business, offering my own clients the same services I provided but at prices that were below cost. His goal wasn't to build a sustainable marketing business. It was to force my consultancy into bankruptcy. The strategy revealed Jake's desperation and calculated cruelty. If he could destroy my business and force me into financial desperation, I'd be unable to pursue the identity theft charges or expose his failures to our parents. He was trying to eliminate the only family member who knew the truth about his situation while simultaneously punishing me for discovering his lies. But Jake's attack on my business became the catalyst for my strategic counterattack. Instead of reacting emotionally or defensively, I began planning my response with the same methodical approach I used for client marketing campaigns. First, I documented everything. Jake's identity theft, the fraudulent credit accounts, the client list theft, and his predatory pricing all became part of a comprehensive evidence file. I tracked dates, amounts, and witnesses for every incident. I gathered bank statements, credit reports, and client communications that proved the systematic nature of his financial crimes and business interference. Second, I researched Jake's actual business finances and discovered he'd committed additional forms of fraud beyond what I'd already uncovered. The financial documents he'd shown our parents included fake tax returns, fabricated equipment purchases, and completely fictional employee records. He'd created an elaborate web of lies to maintain the illusion of business success while burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars. Third, I consulted with an attorney who specialized in business litigation and identity theft cases. Sarah Williams, the lawyer I hired, confirmed that I had strong grounds for both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. Jake's business interference constituted theft of trade secrets. His identity theft violated multiple federal laws, and his fraudulent representations to our parents might constitute securities fraud if he'd formally solicited their investment. Fourth, I began rebuilding my client relationships by focusing on the superior value I could provide compared to Jake's desperate price-cutting approach. Instead of trying to match his below-cost pricing, I emphasized quality, reliability, and proven results. I offered potential clients detailed case studies of my successful campaigns, references from satisfied customers, and guarantees based on my track record of actual performance. The difference between substance and desperation became clear quickly. Business owners weren't just looking for the cheapest option. They wanted marketing partners who could deliver real results. My portfolio of successful campaigns spoke louder than Jake's artificially low prices, especially when potential clients started hearing rumors about his unpaid employees and abandoned warehouse. Finally, I began preparing my parents for the truth, through careful questioning rather than direct accusations. During family conversations, I asked innocent questions about Jake's business progress. How many clients had he signed? What were his monthly revenues? Could they see his financial statements? When would the solar panel installation be completed? Their answers revealed they had no real information about Jake's business performance beyond his verbal assurances. They couldn't name a single client, didn't know his actual revenue numbers, and had never seen legitimate financial reports. Their $400,000 investment had been made based entirely on hope and favoritism, rather than any factual business analysis. My strategic patience was paying off. The evidence file was comprehensive enough for prosecution, my business was recovering from Jake's sabotage attempts, and my parents were starting to ask their own questions about inconsistencies in Jake's success stories. The foundation was laid for exposing the truth in a way that would be undeniable and comprehensive. Jake's house of cards was about to collapse completely, and this time I would control how the truth emerged. My strategic preparation proved essential when our family's financial crisis reached its breaking point. Tom Henderson, my parents' financial advisor for the past 15 years, called an emergency meeting that would shatter every illusion Jake had carefully maintained. Initially, David and Margaret tried to keep the meeting private, but I insisted on attending as someone with legitimate concerns about family financial decisions that had already affected me directly. Tom's opening statement was devastating in its clinical precision. David and Margaret were facing personal bankruptcy due to investment decisions that had spiraled far beyond what they'd originally authorized. The retirement home mortgage was just the beginning of their financial exposure. Jake had convinced them to co-sign additional business loans totaling $150,000, all of which were now in default due to non-payment. Their credit rating had been destroyed by the defaults. Their retirement savings accounts had been liquidated to cover loan payments. Creditors were demanding immediate payment on obligations that now totaled over $700,000 when combining the direct investments, the co-signed loans, and accumulated interest and penalties. Tom's conservative estimate suggested they would lose their primary residence, their retirement property, and face potential wage garnishment unless the situation was resolved within 30 days. The room fell silent as Tom outlined the scope of their financial disaster. Margaret's hands were shaking as she processed the reality that they'd gone from comfortable retirement planning to potential homelessness in less than 6 months. David kept asking Tom to repeat the numbers, unable to comprehend how their strategic investment had become a catastrophic loss. When Tom asked to review Jake's business financial records to understand how such substantial investments had generated no returns, David admitted with obvious embarrassment that Jake had been too busy with business expansion to provide detailed monthly reports. Tom's expression showed the professional patience of someone who'd seen this scenario too many times. He explained gently that legitimate businesses always provide comprehensive financial statements to investors, especially family investors who'd committed their life savings. This was my moment. I produced the evidence folder I'd been preparing for weeks, organized with the thoroughness of a criminal prosecution case. I showed them documentation of the identity theft, printouts of the fraudulent credit accounts opened in my name, records of Jake's client list theft, and research proving his business model had been copied from a failed company. But the most damning evidence was financial. Bank statements showed Jake's excessive personal spending throughout the business failure. Expensive dinners, weekend trips, luxury purchases that had nothing to do with cryptocurrency mining operations. I presented witness statements from his former employees about months of unpaid wages and the systematic sale of equipment to cover debts. I showed them the fabricated reports Jake had been providing about his business performance. Side by side with real bank statements, the lies were obvious. Equipment purchases that never happened, client revenues that didn't exist, employee payments that had bounced, and operational expenses that were actually personal entertainment costs. The crushing revelation came when David tried to call Jake for an explanation of the discrepancies, only to discover his phone was disconnected. Margaret's attempts to reach him through social media and email went unanswered. When we drove to his warehouse for a direct confrontation, we found the facility completely abandoned. The landlord was waiting with an eviction notice. Jake had terminated his lease 3 weeks earlier, loading everything remaining into a U-Haul truck, with help from a young woman the landlord described as his girlfriend. There was no forwarding address, no contact information, and no indication of where he'd gone with whatever money remained from our family's destruction. A neighbor from the adjacent warehouse had witnessed the hasty departure. Jake and Sarah had worked frantically to load personal items, remaining equipment, and boxes of documents into the moving truck. Their body language suggested urgency and secrecy, rather than a planned relocation. They disappeared in the middle of the night like criminals fleeing prosecution. Standing in that empty warehouse, surrounded by abandoned furniture and disconnected electrical outlets, the full scope of Jake's betrayal became clear to my parents. He hadn't just failed in business. He'd systematically lied to them for months while stealing their life savings. He'd used their love and trust as weapons against their financial security. More devastating was the realization that Jake had fled rather than face accountability. The son they'd supported unconditionally, defended against my warnings, and funded with their retirement dreams, had abandoned them to bankruptcy rather than admit his failures and work toward solutions. Margaret broke down completely, sobbing apologies to me that came 8 months too late. She begged for forgiveness for years of favoritism, for stealing my college fund, for dismissing my business achievements while celebrating Jake's lies. David stood speechless, staring at the evidence of financial documents that proved every concern I'd raised had been accurate, while every promise Jake had made was false. Through their tears, they asked the question I'd been dreading. Could I help them avoid bankruptcy? Did my business success provide any options for salvaging their financial situation before they lost everything they'd worked 30 years to build? Looking at my parents' devastated faces in that abandoned warehouse, I faced the biggest decision of my adult life. They'd betrayed me, stolen from me, and ignored my achievements while funding my brother's lies. Justice would suggest letting them face the natural consequences of their choices. But mercy suggested something more complicated. The family that had failed me was asking for help they didn't deserve, but desperately needed. The weight of my parents' financial crisis, an emotional breakdown, forced me to confront who I wanted to be when faced with the ultimate test of character. I could walk away from the family that had betrayed me, letting David and Margaret face bankruptcy as the natural consequence of their blindness and favoritism. Or I could choose the harder path of forgiveness paired with accountability, using my business success to help them rebuild while establishing clear boundaries for our future relationship. After 3 sleepless nights of soul-searching, I chose mercy over vengeance, but with conditions that would prevent future betrayals. I agreed to help my parents avoid bankruptcy, but only if they committed to fundamental changes in how our family operated. They had to attend family counseling to address the decades of favoritism that had poisoned our relationships. They had to sign legal documents acknowledging the money they'd stolen from me and committing to repayment with interest. Most importantly, any future family financial decisions would require unanimous agreement from all family members. The practical work of financial recovery began immediately. My excellent credit rating and growing business relationships became tools for negotiating with creditors who were demanding immediate payment. I hired Sarah Williams, the attorney who'd been handling my identity theft case, to represent my parents in bankruptcy avoidance negotiations. Her expertise in financial law proved invaluable in creating payment plans that prevented foreclosure while establishing realistic timelines for debt resolution. The most emotionally difficult decision was helping my parents sell their primary residence to downsize and eliminate mortgage debt. The 4-bedroom house where Jake and I had grown up held decades of family memories, but it also represented monthly payments they could no longer afford. We found a smaller home in a more affordable neighborhood that would allow them to maintain independence while reducing their financial obligations dramatically. My expanding business provided opportunities for my parents to contribute productively to their own financial recovery. David's accounting background made him valuable for managing my company's financial records and tax planning. Margaret's organizational skills proved excellent for client relationship management and administrative coordination. Hiring them part-time allowed me to expand my services while giving them dignified work that contributed to paying off their debts. The criminal prosecution of Jake moved forward despite family complications. Detective Barnes had built a strong case based on the evidence I'd provided, and federal prosecutors were interested in the identity theft charges because they crossed state lines when Jake fled to Nevada. 6 months after his disappearance, Jake was arrested in Las Vegas, attempting to use my identity to secure funding for another business venture. The trial process was emotionally devastating for our family, but it also provided closure and accountability that years of therapy might never have achieved. Jake's defense attorney initially tried to characterize his crimes as family misunderstandings blown out of proportion by prosecutors, but the evidence of systematic fraud was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, and witness testimony painted a clear picture of calculated financial manipulation. During his testimony, Jake finally showed what seemed like genuine remorse, rather than the self-serving apologies I'd heard during his desperate attempts to avoid consequences. He admitted that his sense of entitlement and fear of disappointing our parents had led him to make increasingly destructive decisions. He acknowledged that his attacks on my business had been cruel attempts to silence the only person who knew the truth about his failures. Jake pleaded guilty to identity theft, fraud, and business interference charges, accepting a prison sentence of 18 months plus restitution payments that would continue for years. His admission of guilt provided legal closure, but more importantly, it gave our family a foundation of acknowledged truth rather than continued denial and blame shifting. My business growth accelerated during the family crisis recovery period. The combination of Amy's operational excellence, my parents' administrative support, and my renewed focus on strategic planning resulted in 20 employees and 2 office locations within 18 months of Jake's arrest. Local business networks began recognizing my company's success story, leading to speaking opportunities at Chamber of Commerce events and consulting contracts with larger regional corporations. The most meaningful recognition came when the Denver Chamber of Commerce selected me for their Young Entrepreneur of the Year award. The nomination cited my company's growth despite challenging circumstances and my commitment to ethical business practices. Standing at the podium accepting the award, I saw my parents in the audience with expressions of genuine pride that I'd never witnessed during childhood. My acceptance speech focused on lessons learned through adversity rather than celebrating personal achievement. I talked about building success through integrity instead of shortcuts, earning respect through results rather than favoritism, and finding strength through challenges instead of advantages. The audience responded enthusiastically to themes of perseverance and authenticity in a business world often dominated by flashy promises and quick profit schemes. Family therapy sessions revealed patterns that had shaped our dysfunction for decades. Margaret and David learned to recognize how their unconscious favoritism toward Jake had damaged both of their children. Jake by enabling irresponsibility and me by withholding deserved recognition. I learned to set healthy boundaries without holding grudges, understanding that forgiveness didn't require forgetting or accepting future mistreatment. Even Jake participated in family healing sessions during supervised prison visits. The structure of incarceration seemed to provide the accountability he'd never experienced, forcing him to confront his choices without the escape routes that had enabled his destructive behavior. His participation in counseling showed genuine effort to understand his impact on others, rather than just seeking sympathy for his consequences. The financial recovery took 3 years of careful planning and consistent execution, but my parents eventually achieved stability without declaring bankruptcy. The combination of debt consolidation, steady income from working in my business, and proceeds from downsizing their lifestyle created a sustainable path forward. They maintained their independence, while learning to live within realistic means. My relationship with David and Margaret transformed from the resentment and disappointment that had defined my young adulthood into something approaching genuine mutual respect. They began acknowledging my achievements without requiring dramatic crises to gain their attention. I learned to accept their appreciation without needing validation I'd been denied for decades. The deepest satisfaction came from realizing that fighting for myself had ultimately saved my entire family. My refusal to enable Jake's destructive behavior, my insistence on accountability and truth, and my decision to help with recovery while maintaining boundaries had forced everyone to grow in ways that pure indulgence never could have achieved. Jake's eventual release from prison marked another step in our family's healing process. His participation in rehabilitation programs and victim impact counseling had produced changes that seemed genuine rather than manipulative. While trust would need to be rebuilt gradually through consistent behavior rather than promises, there was hope for eventual reconciliation based on truth rather than fantasy. My business continued expanding beyond Denver into regional markets throughout Colorado. The combination of ethical practices, proven results, and authentic leadership had created a reputation that attracted clients who valued substance over flashy marketing promises. Amy became my full business partner, and together we developed training programs for other marketing professionals who wanted to build sustainable practices. The life lesson that emerged from this painful journey became the foundation of my personal and professional philosophy. True success comes from integrity, hard work, and authentic relationships rather than shortcuts, manipulation, or unearned advantages. Adversity had taught me that protecting yourself from dysfunction isn't selfish. It's often an act of love that forces necessary growth for everyone involved. Standing in my expanded office overlooking downtown Denver, watching my team serve clients with the same commitment to excellence that had sustained me through the darkest family betrayals, I understood that being told to figure it out myself had been the greatest gift my parents could have given me. Their rejection had forced me to develop strength, resourcefulness, and independence that no amount of financial support could have provided. The teenager who'd been ignored while her twin received constant praise had become a successful businesswoman who'd learned that real achievement comes from internal motivation rather than external validation. The young woman who'd been told her dreams didn't deserve family investment had built something more valuable than money, a sense of purpose and accomplishment that belonged entirely to her. Family relationships had been rebuilt on foundations of honesty and mutual respect rather than favoritism and fantasy. Jake had learned accountability through consequences rather than enablement. My parents had discovered that supporting their children's growth sometimes requires difficult love instead of unconditional funding. The revolution hadn't been in cryptocurrency mining or green energy technology. The revolution had been in choosing truth over comfortable lies, growth over stagnation, and authentic success over artificial advantages. That revolution had been worth every painful step of the journey. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced favoritism in your family that affected major life decisions? How did you handle a situation where family members undermined your success while supporting someone else's failures? Share your story in the comments below because your experience might help someone else going through similar challenges. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others find it. Subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories about overcoming family betrayal and building success despite difficult circumstances. And please share this video with anyone who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in dealing with complicated family dynamics. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it encourages you to fight for your own dreams even when the people closest to you don't believe in them. Remember, sometimes the greatest success comes from proving wrong the people who should have supported you from the beginning.